I'm going to try and put together now what the past, the present, and the future of well-being might be. And in a way, I've kind of evolved through these phases myself, so I'd like to give you a little background about myself. I went to medical school in India at the age of 17, and I graduated at the age of 22, 23. The school I went to was funded by the United States, various foundations, including the Rockefeller Foundation and some foundations from New Zealand. So I got an education which was the equivalent of an American medical education. And at the end of my 4 years, before I would start my internship, I got a letter from a foundation in the United States that I would be given a scholarship to come and train here for advanced medicine. It's an extraordinary offer. Everything was paid for. The only problem was that in India, they had foreign exchange regulations at that time, so you couldn't leave the country with more than $8. And furthermore, you had to do an exam that had to be approved by the American Medical Association. And the exam itself was banned in India. So I had to go to Sri Lanka to do the exam. And I got my $8, and there was an uncle that I had in London who lent me $100, so I had now $108. If you know anything about Indian mythology, 108 is a very auspicious number, mystical number. So I thought I should do something really auspicious with my $108. I went to Paris, and I spent it all in one night at the Moulin Rouge. So when I arrived in the United States, JFK Airport, I had nothing, zero. But I had heard of this custom that I was only familiar with because other people had told me about it. It was called a collect call. So I made a collect call to my hospital administrator in a small town called Plainfield, New Jersey. And they were so desperate for doctors, which I didn't know. I didn't know the background. The Vietnam War was coming to an end. All American doctors were in the army. There was a shortage of physicians in community hospitals. And we were being trained in other countries and recruited, being imported here. So that was the background. When I called my hospital administrator, I said, I don't have any money. He said, don't worry, just stay where you are. And they sent me a helicopter. So my first experience of the United States is lifting off in a helicopter, looking out of the window at the skyline in Manhattan, and saying, maybe they made a mistake. This is what Disney World must be like. In any case, 20 minutes later, I was in this very small town called Plainfield, New Jersey. Even for an Indian, it was Plainfield. But I immediately was taken to my hospital, and my first rotation was going to be in the emergency room. I reported to the nurse, who said she would call me when she needed me. I should go to my dorm and get over my jet lag, etc., etc. So I went to the dorm, and I switched on the television set with the remote control. Now, this was a very new experience for me because in India there was no TV when I left. So I'd never seen a television set, and suddenly I was seeing color on a TV set. Wimbledon, I still remember. And I was watching it when suddenly the program was interrupted And there was a news bulletin. And the news bulletin said that there was a holdup at a local bank, and some policemen had been wounded. One, in fact, had been killed. And they were being brought to the emergency room where I was going to start my rotation. Now, having been to a really good medical school, but never having seen a patient, I had my first panic attack. Shortly thereafter, the nurse called me, and she said, "Dr. Chopra, we have an expiration." I had no idea what that word meant, but I didn't want to let on, so I said, "You bet, I'll be there." And I bounded down the stairway, and the nurse showed me into a room where there were lots of machines, and a patient, a dead body with all kinds of tubes, wires, and I looked at the patient. You know, where I came from, there were lots of people and no machines. In this room, there were lots of machines and no people. But nevertheless, I made my first diagnosis. I looked at the patient, I looked at the nurse, and I said, "He's dead." She said, "I told you, we had an expiration." So at least I knew what the word meant, expiration, the opposite of inspiration. But I still was confused. If a patient is dead, why do you need a doctor? So I looked at the nurse. I said, "If he's already dead, what do you want me to do?" And she looked at me very sternly, pointed her finger like this, and she said, "Pronounce him." I'd never heard that before. Your soul can't leave your body unless a medical deity, MD, says, "I release you, now you go." But then something clicked. And I said, she wants me to do the rituals that we doctors do. You know, doctors have their own rituals. We're like modern shamans. We wear white coats instead of leopard skins. We have a stethoscope around our head, instead of feathers, even though I really don't think stethoscopes have any use anymore. We use Latin mantras instead of Aborigine mantras. And instead of dancing around a fire, we dance around CAT scanners. So I understood she wanted me to do a ritual. Listen to the heart, examine the pupils, things like that. So having trained in India, where we speak English a little differently, it's more similar to English than American English, although it's Indian English, where the word for a flashlight is a torch. I asked my nurse if I could have a torch. And she looked at me, and by now there were other nurses outside. They were watching this whole show, and my nurse looked at the nurse outside, and she said, "He wants a torch." And the nurse outside looked at me, kind of looked me up and down, and she said, "Maybe he wants to do a cremation." So, introduction to American medicine. Here's what happened. Within 6 hours, I was totally at home in the emergency room. I suddenly discovered I had surgical skills. And I loved to see wounded people. And that the worse, the more gory the wounds, the more I relished the experience. I didn't want to leave. It didn't even occur to me that the patient could be suffering. All I wanted to do was make a diagnosis and practice my skills. And this went on for 24 hours. And finally, the nurse said, you need to get some rest. I said, I don't want to go. She said, no, you've got to get rest. Our interns and residents, they don't get enough sleep and they make big mistakes. So I said, okay. Very reluctantly, I left and I went to my dorm. I couldn't get any sleep. I was reminiscing over my wonderful experience in the emergency room.